Learn how to build a tabs component in alignment with the ARIA Authoring Practices Guide tabs pattern. That is a mouthful, so we're going to simplify this and refer to it as the tab specifications or tab specs or some variation of that. And we're going to go step by step, learning how to parse through the specs and implement the component while adhering to the guidelines. We're also going to be using React. You have familiarity with another front-end framework, you should be fine. But if you want to learn more, you can always reference the official documentation. And as far as like the concepts we're going to learn, we're going to cover things like ARIA attributes, focus management, keyboard interactions, things of that nature. Alrighty, so I want to pause and take a minute to look through the tabs pattern documentation because we'll be referencing this a lot. And so I just want to give a quick overview of how the document is organized. As you can see at the top of the page here, it has an about this pattern section. And this is where you'll get like a brief overview of what the tabs pattern is about. It also includes like terms used to describe the design pattern. So like tabs or tabbed interface, see tab list, tab panel, all those terms are referenced throughout the documentation. And that section gives you a quick, just like one-liner about what each thing represents. And then the next section is kind of the keyboard interactions. And this is where it outlines how you need to implement certain keyboard functionalities for this component pattern. So as you see, we have tab here. We have left arrow, right arrow. It's giving us description of how we need to implement that. And we'll see how to do that in the third lesson in this module. And then last but not least, we have the ARIA role states and properties. And this kind of gives you, the ARIA attributes and things that you need to wire up to properly set things up so that assistive technologies can properly identify the component pattern that we're building. So just wanted to take some time to go through this, and we'll dive deeper as we implement and go. So now I just want to go through the files that we'll be using to implement the component. And so the first we'll take a look at is app.jsx. And this file just serves as the entry point for the project. And this will be the location where we render the tabs component and pass the props that the component accepts. So you won't really do anything in this file. It's set everything up for you, but it's good to know what it does. So next is tabs.jsx, and this file provides the boilerplate for what a potential implementation of a tabs component might look like. And we're going to be working solely in this file, really. And all the props that the component accepts, which are outlined in the tabs.proptypes definition at the top, will need to be wired up accordingly. So like I said, we'll be spending a majority of our time here. The last file we'll take a look at is tabs.css. And again, to help you concentrate exclusively on the essential aspects of implementing the tabs component, the CSS has already been supplied. However, this file can be a valuable resource for exploring additional styling techniques with ARIA attributes. So even though we won't add anything to this file, feel free to check it out to see how I'm applying different styles using the different selectors. And again, like in a real world application, you wouldn't really target, CSS selectors exactly like how we're doing here. That's just for simplicity's sake. Just wanted to make that known. And as far as dependencies go, there's actually only one in this one, and that's the prop types package, which is used for runtime type checking. Now that we have an overview of what we're building, we'll kick things off by putting into action the instructions laid out in the ARIA role states and properties section of the documentation. We'll proceed methodically, adding code step by step, demonstrating the gradual process involved in implementing the tabs component pattern. So let's take a look at the first bullet point in this section of the documentation. And it reads, the element that serves as a container for the set of tabs has role tab list. So if we go back to our tabs.jsx file within Code Sandbox, we're going to start things off by building our base for our tabs component. And to do this, we'll add two div elements. So the first div will act as the root element for the inner tab component parts. And the second div aligns with the specifications, functioning as the encompassing container for the tab elements. And this specific element will be designated with the tab list role. And as you can see, now our tabs, we kind of start to see some things show up on the right-hand side of the screen. Okay, so now let's go back to the tab specs and take a look at the second bullet point. And this one reads, each element that serves as a tab has role tab and is contained within the element with role tab list. Let's go back to Code Sandbox, and with our container in place, we can now start integrating the tab elements. And to achieve this, we'll utilize the tab list prop, which holds an array of object details for each tab. We're going to iterate through this list to present the container with the tab list role. And considering the interactive nature of tabs, we'll implement the use of the button element, and each button element will be assigned the tab role. All right, so let's go back to the specs and take a look at the third bullet point, which reads, each element that contains the content panel for a tab has role tab panel. When you interact with a tab, the expected behavior is that it will reveal some kind of content. We will once more iterate through the tab list prop, generating separate div elements, each designated to hold distinct content for display. Each of these div elements will be attributed with the tab panel role, which is used to indicate that it is an element that contains the content associated with a particular tab. Outside the div with the tab list role, but within the parent container, we will add the following code. All right, so going back to our specs one more time, let's look at the fourth bullet point, which says, if the tab has a visible label, the element with role tab list has ARIA labeled by set to a value that refers to the labeling element. Otherwise, the tab list element has a label provided by ARIA label. So in this particular example, there intentionally isn't a visible label since this is a simple demo, and we've previously clarified that the tabs component is presenting quotes from renowned jazz musicians. Therefore, we'll assign an ARIA label to the div holding the tab list role. And the ARIA label attribute will allow you to define a value that labels an interactive element, which in this case is the tabs interface. And we define that label in the app.jsx file, which just says jazz musician quotes. All right, so going back to the tab specs and looking at the next bullet point, we'll see that it reads, each element with role tab has a property ARIA controls, referring to its associated tab panel element. When you're utilizing an interactive component like a tab to modify other elements, you can use the ARIA controls attribute to link the controlling element to its corresponding elements that it affects. And to effectively tackle this step, we must assign an ID to the div elements with the tab panel role. And in sync with this, we must introduce an ARIA controls attribute to our tab element, and the value assigned to this attribute should match the value of the ID applied to the corresponding tab panel elements. Alrighty, back to the tab specs. As you notice, there's a pattern. We're kind of going back and forth as we implement. The next bullet point that we see there is the active tab element has the state ARIA selected set to true, and all other tab elements have it set to false. Up until this point, you've probably observed that all tab contents are visible on the screen. And to display only the currently selected tab's content, we must begin tracking the active tab. Implementing this specification will involve multiple steps, so we're going to walk through each one. And the first step is finding the active tab index. Since we're creating a controlled React component, meaning the logic is driven by props rather than its own local state, since the parent component specifies its behavior, we will have to rely on the value prop to determine which tab is active. In order to determine this, we will define a variable at the top of the component that iterates through the array of tabs and gives us the index of the currently active tab. The next step is determining the selected tab. And we need to add an onClick handler to the button element so that clicking on the tab element properly updates the value prop. Then we'll take the active tab index variable from the previous step and use it to determine the appropriate value to pass to the ARIA selected attribute. Third step in this process is controlling how to show and hide the content. So with the active tab now being monitored through the active tab index variable, we can leverage it to decide when to display or hide the relevant content. And there are various ways we can achieve this, such as selectively adding a hidden class to the div containing tab contents. However, for today, we're going to opt for a different approach, using a distinct data attribute named data-active-content. And this choice ensures clear visibility in the DOM regarding the ongoing action. So inside the tab.css style sheet, you'll actually come across a CSS selector that detects when data active content is equal to false, and then utilizes the display none property to eliminate the content of inactive tabs from the DOM. So that's kind of how that whole show hide process is working. So let's go back to the specs now and go to the next bullet point, which says each element with role tab panel has the property ARIA labeled by, referring to its associated tab element. So each tab element has an ID attribute, and we're going to take that ID and pass it to the ARIA labeled by attribute that gets applied to each tab panel element. Okay, once more now to the specs. We can skip the second to last bullet point because we don't have a pop-up menu within this particular tab's implementation. So just going to the last bullet point here, we see that it reads, if the tab list element is vertically oriented, it has the property ARIA orientation set to vertical. The default value of ARIA orientation for a tab list element is horizontal. So even though it's default, I want us to explicitly set it to horizontal. So, and our tabs component is only intended to be displayed horizontally. So let's just go ahead and apply the ARIA orientation equals horizontal to the div with the tab list role applied to it. And just as a refresher, the ARIA orientation attribute is used to indicate to assistive technologies whether an element's orientation is horizontal, vertical, or undefined. Understanding the orientation is key for users to navigate specific widgets effectively, as it influences the anticipated actions of directional moves. Alrighty, so we've made a ton of progress so far, but our work is not done yet. At this point in our implementation, the component only works as expected when you're using a mouse to interact with the tabs. We'll complete our implementation by introducing keyboard interactions. We'll finish building out our tabs component by implementing the keyboard interaction section of the tabs pattern specs. According to the specs, there are two variations of the tabs pattern that can be implemented. One is the tabs with manual activation, and then the other is tabs with automatic activation. For this example, we'll opt for the latter approach, automatically activating the tabs and showing their corresponding panels upon receiving focus. But just to show an example of the two, tabs with manual activation, as you can see, I'm kind of tabbing through this one, but the content is not displaying until I press enter. And then the content for that particular tab that I'm focused on will display. So that's kind of the unique distinction there. It doesn't show the content unless you explicitly say so. Well, if we go to the automatic activation example, and this is the one you'll see 90% of the time in the wild, by the way, as I rove through each tab, it displays the currently focused tab's content. So that's the one that we'll be implementing. But I just wanted to show different examples of how they look and what the distinctions are. Okay, so this means that we will not need to implement the space or enter key as outlined in the specs. And additionally, for the sake of brevity, we'll skip incorporating optional keyboard interactions. For example, the home and end keys. So yeah, so as you see here, like none of the optional things we'll implement just to keep it kind of simple. And then the space or enter key would kind of be not needed because we are doing the automatic activation. So that will leave us with the tab key, the left arrow key, and the right arrow key. So looking at the first bullet point within the tab key, it reads, when focus moves into the tab list, it places focus on the active tab element. So let's go back to tabs.jsx within Code Sandbox. And the first thing we need to do is add the tab index attribute to the button element with the following logic. And button elements are focusable by default, but our added logic ensures that only the currently active tab stays focusable. Without this, if a user continually pressed the tab key, it would move through each button instead of switching focus to the tab panel element. So as you can see in my example, I'm actually going to revoke the code that I just added so you can see what the default behavior is with the buttons. As I press the tab key, it's going through each button because they're focusable by default, like I said. However, when I add back in the tab index logic, you'll notice that I can tab to the first button, but then after that, it goes away. And so that actually transitions us nicely into our second bullet point within the tab key, which is when the tab list contains focus, it moves focus to the next element in the page tab sequence outside the tab list, which is the tab panel unless the first element containing meaningful content inside the tab panel is focusable. So going back to Code Sandbox, the second thing we need to do is apply a tab index equals 0 to all the tab panel elements so they can be focusable when they are in the DOM. So now when we press tab, we go to the first tab, which is stand gets in this case. And then pressing tab again will take us into the tab panel content. Okay, so now we've got our tab key implementation wired up. Let's move on to the left arrow key. And the first bullet point here says left arrow moves focus to the previous tab. If focus is on the first tab, it moves focus to the last tab. It optionally activates the newly focused tab. So note here that since we're implementing tabs with automatic activation, that last sentence is not optional for us, and we must make it so that pressing the key activates the new tab. So going back to the code, we need to capture key presses, and we'll include a keyboard event handler function and attach it to the div with the tab list role using the onKeyDown attribute. Additionally, we'll create a handle keydown function with a component that will be provided to the onKeyDown handler. So the handle keydown function will be responsible for processing the logic of the arrow key presses and should include the following code. Right now, it's just wired up for the left arrow key. And here's kind of a breakdown of what we have. So the switch statement will match on the key property of the keyboard event and attempt to guide the user to the desired tab. If the tab they're trying to navigate to falls within the array bounds, so for this particular example, between 0 and 2, since there are 3 tabs, it will pass the value of that tab to the onValueChange prop. However, if the user is at the first tab and the index is less than 0, it signifies that we're at the end of the list and need to cycle back to the last tab. Alrighty, so now we have our left arrow key working. Let's go ahead and go back to the specs and read out what's required for the right arrow key. The right arrow should move focus to the next tab. If focus is on the last tab element, it moves focus to the first tab and optionally activates the newly focused tab. So similarly to the left arrow key, this last sentence is not optional for us, and we need to make sure that pressing the key activates the new tab. So implementing the right arrow key will be actually a similar process to its counterpart. And to register this additional key, we need to update the handle keydown function we just created to also check for the arrow right key event. And the code breakdown for the arrow right key is very similar to that of the arrow left key, the main difference being that we increment by 1 when the right arrow is pressed instead of decrementing. We will still perform our out of bounds array check. However, this time, if the index of the tab they are trying to go to matches the length of the tab list array, then we loop them back around to the beginning of the list. Integrating this logic actually introduces the concept of roving tab index, which is a lesson we covered earlier on in the course. Okay, so we've got our arrow key navigation and active states working, but there's still a little bit of a snag. The focus doesn't change as we move through the tabs. So to fix this, we'll dive into React's useRef hook and learn how to switch focus to the appropriate element. So since this isn't a React course, I'm not going to dive too deep into the weeds of hooks and refs. However, if you'd like to learn more, feel free to check out the official React documentation. Okay, so the first step we're going to do is create a variable with the component that will house an array of refs using the useRef hook. This array will hold the references to all the button elements and needs to be defined at the top of the component. The second step is assigning the ref to buttons. So inside the mapping function where we create the button elements, we need to use a callback ref to assign the ref to each button. The callback is executed with the DOM element as an argument, and you store that element in the button refs array at the corresponding index. So this code essentially says when a button is created, store a reference to it in the button refs array at the same index as its position in the props.tabs list array. Thirdly, we need to shift focus with the arrow keys. So in the handle keydown function, when the left arrow or right arrow keys are pressed, we can now use the button refs array to access the button elements and shift the focus. So this code accesses the corresponding button element with the button refs array, and then it calls the focus method on it. Okay, time for some testing. And we're going to run some accessibility audits to make sure our implementation is rock solid. So let's open up our Code Sandbox preview in a new tab so that when we run the Axe DevTools extension, we ensure it's only running on the preview and not in the sandbox environment. And when we run a Swift scan, it confirms that everything looks good and that there are no accessibility concerns, which is great. Next, we'll test out our functionality with a screen reader. So to start up VoiceOver, we'll press the shortcut Command F5. And we'll start by pressing the Tab key to select the first tab. And the screen reader will announce Stan Getz selected tab 1 of 3. Then we'll use the right arrow to move to the second tab, and the screen reader will announce Ella Fitzgerald selected tab 2 of 3. And while focused on the second tab, let's press the Tab key again, and then this action will shift the focus into the corresponding tab panel. And the screen reader will announce Ella Fitzgerald tab panel.
Selected tab 2 of 3. Jazz musician quote. Charlie Parker. Selected tab 3. Stan Getz. Selected tab 1. Charlie Parker. Selected tab Ella Fitzgerald.
And voila! We have now successfully implemented an accessible tabs component. The ARIA Authoring Practices Guide provides a myriad of patterns and is a great resource to use when creating custom components.
If you want to keep learning about how to build real-world apps with the latest technologies and other career-related topics, then start right now by subscribing to our channel and liking this video.